E.V.O. Search for Eden is an odd little action RPG released for the SNES all the way back in 1993. Rather than building a party of adventurers and embarking on an epic quest to save the world from some dark lord, which was pretty much the norm at the time, E.V.O. puts you in the role of a creature that you guide through the early stages of Earth's geological history, with the game's main gimmick using evolution as the driving growth mechanic. It's an ambitious concept, especially given the time that this game was made. As I've alluded to before, console RPGs were fairly formulaic, and they all use similar tropes, which caused the genre to have a very strong identity containing familiar elements. E.V.O. isn't really an exception to this, but to give it some credit, it does try to adapt those elements into something more exciting and much more action-oriented. E.V.O. was developed by Almanac under the direction of Takeshi Yaneda, who had designed ActRaiser while working for Quintet 3 years prior. Like ActRaiser, E.V.O. was also published by Enix, who was very well known for the role-playing game portfolio. What many people don't know is that this is actually a remake of Almanac's very first game, 1990's E.V.O. Theory of Evolution, or more accurately translated, 4.6 billion year story, The Theory of Evolution. Yeah, shortening it to E.V.O. really makes it roll off the tongue better. Whereas Search for Eden plays more like an action platformer, Theory of Evolution was a proper turn-based RPG, complete with random encounters as you travel an overworld from a top-down perspective. A lot of Theory of Evolution's themes, designs, and plot was ported over to the Super Nintendo version, almost verbatim, and despite the game being a more fantastical rather than hard scientific representation of evolution, Almanac still had local school teachers provide the programmers with some information on geology and biology. Unlike Theory of Evolution, most of the staff working on Search for Eden were younger and much less experienced, which Yaneda said made things interesting during development. As far as being an evolutionary life sim goes, E.V.O. Search for Eden does a decent job of remaking an old Japanese-exclusive computer game into something more appealing to us Baka Gaijin, but it doesn't really stick the landing insofar as developing something robust and with a lot of staying power. It's a game with a great concept, but unfortunately doesn't make the most of it, and its execution leaves much to be desired. I'm not sure if that's due to the inexperience of the development team, or if the project's reach exceeded its grasp, but either way, E.V.O. just doesn't quite look like the next evolution in early 90s RPGs that some may have hoped for. Speaking of looks, let's start with the game's presentation. The graphics are bright, colorful, and stylized, everything you expect out of a Super Nintendo game. All the game's animations are pretty great, too. Everything from attack animations to facial reactions are highly detailed and well composed. And while the game doesn't make heavy use of Mode 7, it still does have layered background textures and parallax skyboxes that give you the perspective of constant motion, which enhances the side-scrolling portion of the game. However, E.V.O. is pretty limited with what it puts on display. At first glance, you see a fairly good-looking game with bright colors and detailed sprites, and that's exactly what it is. Environments look good, and they carry all sort of thematic differentiation depending on which stage of the game that you're in. However, at some point, those backgrounds begin to become a bit repetitive, with some rocks and trees and vegetation all starting to blend in together. The layouts are all different, but the assets definitely don't give each area a distinctive flavor. And nothing demonstrates this more than the fact that I can't actually remember the names of any of the areas in the game, despite the fact that each one displays a placard for you when you hop into it. This same pattern applies to enemies as well. They were varied and interesting enough, but by some point many of them just begin to reappear with fewer and fewer new enemies introduced. A small handful of bosses aren't immune to this either. There's one boss that you fight no fewer than 3 times. Then there's the game's soundtrack, and it's just so bland and mediocre. What I don't understand is that the game's score was composed by none other than Koichi Sugiyama, you know, of Dragon Quest fame, and despite that, the soundtrack just feels so plain. E.V.O.'s soundtrack is actually just a redone and updated version of the soundtrack for Theory of Evolution, but with songs rearranged to be used in different areas. Search for Eden doesn't have battle music, so the old battle theme was reincorporated to this game as the boss fight theme. And the late-stage overworld theme is used as a mere sequential transition. There are parts of the game's soundtrack that are good, While I think I prefer the way that they were used in Theory of Evolution, they nonetheless accentuate the respective area as well, and they do sound pleasant, if lacking a bit of panache in some places. Where this game loses points is with the tracks that were composed specifically for Search for Eden, particularly with any of the tracks that involve dinosaurs. I mean, I guess I get a sense of dinosaurs from this. It sort of reminds me of the theme of ABC's sitcom Dinosaurs, but the bottom line is that these tracks are overly irritating. A short sound loop that plays for several seconds before repeating over and over and over again as the only bit of music that you get on an entire stage can get grating, especially if you're planning on spending a lot of time on that stage because it's particularly lucrative in terms of grinding out experience points. And as underwhelming as the game's presentation may be, Search for Eden tries really hard to at least make up for it with some truly unique gameplay. How it's implemented is another story. The main selling point for E.V.O is that it's an action RPG with an evolutionary gimmick. Rather than leveling up and increasing your stats the way you would in a standard JRPG, here you grind enemies to get experience points that you then spend on body part upgrades. Depending on the sort of creature you are, which is generally dictated by which of the game's 5 stages that you're in, you can upgrade your jaws, your dorsal fin, your legs, your head, increase your body size, and the like. These individual upgrades all have stats associated with them, and mixing and matching various parts dictates the abilities that your creature has. You can check these stats at any time on the pause menu. These upgrades start simply enough, but they get much more complex by the time you reach those later stages of the game where you can play as a lizard or a mammal, and you're given a much bigger variety of parts to choose from. My issue here is that the way that many of these components are labeled just makes it unclear as to what they are. Sure, I know what cat-like jaws are, but an invincible tail? Fierce jaws? What do these mean? A Pronosaurus isn't real, is it? I know Wooper's a Pokemon, let's go with that. Yeah, that seems about right. Oh, I can jump really high now. Obviously. You can also register any evolutionary states that your creature is in, naming it whatever you wish and keeping a record of its components and its stats. You do this so that you can return to that state for a limited amount of time anytime you use a green crystal, which you can collect as you explore the game. There are also these red crystals which transform you into one of several special creatures that you normally can't become through regular evolution. If you pick up one of these crystals and log the evolution like you would any other, you can then spend one of your green crystals to become this creature again. This is actually an effective strategy that works really well in boss fights, especially if you manage to find the secret area where the dragon crystal is located, which I believe is the most powerful evolution in the game. In the later game, there's a lot more variance between these components in terms of how they affect your stats. In the early stages, you don't have too many bad choices when it comes to upgrading. Everything is more or less on a linear progression, with the most expensive components giving you generally the best stats. Later on, however, you have a lot more components that increase one stat while decreasing another, and the give and take between them can really affect how you proceed. The game originally came out with a chart insert that showed you all of the components and how they affect one another. Taking a look at it, it seems like it's a fairly complex system, and it offers a lot of variety when it comes to gameplay, with different builds dictating different methods of overcoming obstacles. In practice though, this really isn't the case. The evolutionary thing isn't leaned into nearly enough. Sometimes you're just going to buy the most expensive thing just because it offers the best stats, and any reductions it offers are negligible at best, or non-existent at worst. The game doesn't really indicate how those numbers are calculated other than a general increase in one area or a decrease in another using a letter grade in that aforementioned chart. And this information is non-existent in the game itself, aside from seeing how your stats were affected after an evolution. As a result, you'll rarely need to make a conscious decision about whether you want one evolutionary component over another one. While there are exceptions to this, such as the reptile armor that offers a massive defensive bonus, but it isn't available to you if you evolve yourself to have 2 legs instead of 4, or something like elongating your neck, which gives you a longer attack range, but then you can't eat any of the health pickup foodstuffs that are on the ground, these dilemmas are pretty few and far between. The biggest is probably deciding if you're going to eventually become a human in the game's final acts, which has some special characteristics, but then it locks you down a particular evolutionary path and it doesn't allow for any further experimentation. Perhaps at the beginning of any new body type, these upgrades feel like they make a bigger difference. Going from your base form to your first upgrade feels huge in terms of what you can do when fighting enemies, but this feeling rarely translates from, say, a mid-tier upgrade to a higher tier upgrade. It feels very incremental and more like a series of diminishing returns rather than any cool new powers that Mother Nature blesses you with. Speaking of combat, E.V.O. Search for Eden follows an approach to his general gameplay loop very similarly to how Zelda 2 did it. Rather than random encounters on the overworld, however, you move your avatar from stage to stage, enter an area, and then go from one end to the other to unlock the next area. These stages are built like typical platformers, with a variety of things to jump on and occasionally explore. You'll enter caves, scale mountains, and fight a lot of respawning enemies. Yeah, respawning enemies. E.V.O. can get grindy. Like, really grindy. The main objective for every stage may be to reach the end, beat the boss, and go on to the next stage, but in order to do that, you need to grind out experience points, which the game calls E.V.O. points, and you use them to purchase your upgrades. You primarily get E.V.O. points by killing enemies, although occasionally you can get a whole bunch of them from these rare blue orbs that are found in certain areas of the game. Combat consists of either biting or charging at the enemies that spawn on the screen, and then swallowing their carcasses before they disappear. This will grant you those precious E.V.O. points as well as regenerating any lost health. So you are, in essence, feeding off the blood of your enemies to become stronger. This includes any enemies that you decide to create yourself. Most of the game's enemies are hostile, but you're free to attack the few non-hostile ones too. It's survival of the fittest after all. Good. Easier for me to walk. Occasionally, an enemy may drop a glowing piece of meat that gives you a much larger E.V.O. point reward, as well as greater health regeneration. Combat itself is simplistic and not overly rewarding. Just hit your attack button on enemies until they die, walk off the screen, and repeat until you can become more powerful. You can also jump on enemies once you upgrade your legs, but only once. Those are the rules. Any attempt to double jump on an enemy results in you taking damage, unless you jump on two enemies and switch back to the first one. It's a dumb system that runs counter to any instinct you may have when jumping on enemies. This is also probably a good place to mention how sloppy the whole thing feels thanks to its stun locking problem. E.V.O. lacks any invincibility frames, which means that it's very easy to find yourself stun locked and just taking a high rate of damage in a very small time frame. This is also determined by your creature size, since the larger you are, the bigger hitbox you have. This generally isn't a detriment, however, since having a bigger body always results in having more hit points, doing more damage, and having better defense, so there really isn't too much of a downside. Not to mention that without an elongated neck, you have a pretty short attack range. It's balanced out by the fact that most of your enemies do as well, but they also have other attacks that can be really annoying to deal with. You also have a charge attack, which consists of timing your collision with an enemy by hitting the A button just before you touch them, but again, it may not be available based on your build. The exception to all this are horns, which dramatically increase your charging attack power and let you do damage without a button press, but you run the risk of breaking them, repeatedly. They're glass cannons, and I found them much more useful as a situational evolution to give you a leg up if you're struggling. And if you don't evolve enough before entering a new area, you'll promptly find yourself getting tossed around like the Dark Souls comparison to any video game that has a modicum of difficulty. Yeah. E.V.O. The Search for Eden is the Dark Souls of 16-bit evolutionary-themed ARPGs. The best strategy, therefore, feels like it's to just grind as many E.V.O. points as you can, until you get the highest upgrades possible for every category that you want, and then stomp your way to the exit. Then, spend time to bank as many E.V.O. points as you can just in case you find yourself struggling against the final boss. Since swapping out body components heals your health completely, not only is it useful, but it's advisable to evolve and devolve during boss fights to give yourself a second, third, or even fourth wind. In fact, the game manual even strongly encourages this by leaving a not-so-subtle hint about it. Plus, spending all that extra time grinding will eventually allow you the chance to evolve into a mammal. A little bit more on that later. And that's basically all there is to E.V.O. Repeat that loop for 5 stages, beat the final boss, and you reach the game's ending. But the game is a little more nuanced than that, and each of the game's 5 stages offers a little bit of narrative context for what's happening around you. As you progress into the game, the plot, such as it is, expands and unfolds into a finale that deserves at least a little bit of contextualization to understand. The game's initial setup is simple enough. It starts off with the sun telling Gaia that every billion years she will produce children called life. One of these children is destined to go on to begin a new era, should they survive a trial. If they can demonstrate that they are indeed the fittest of the species to survive, then the sun will allow them to join Gaia as a partner and enter into Eden. It's in these first story seeds that we see the game's narrative scope not being one about the evolutionary history of the world, but one using the creation myth to help guide that story along. This mythology will also act as a pretext for some of the game's later story elements as well, and I can't help but feel that it's just unneeded fluff. Given the fact that at its core E.V.O is a fantasy game, the mythological stuff works, but it's far less interesting than a game rooted in the actual struggle to rise to the top of the food chain and dominate the Earth. Either way, Gaia approaches you, who happens to already be a fish, and fills you in on these details. She then sends you on your way. This brings us to the first chapter of the game, The Time Before Land. I should also mention that I'm going to be going over the game's story, such as it is in this next section, so if you don't want any spoilers, skip to the conclusion. Chapter 1 is the most straightforward of the stages, and it includes the most linear progressions when it comes to gameplay. That's to be expected, however, since it essentially acts as a large tutorial stage that culminates with a boss fight and an eventual growth spurt that sees you walk on land. This trend continues gradually up until you hit the third chapter, where the game's complexity increases a fair bit. There's an optional area that you can explore here which gives you the opportunity to evolve from a reptile into a bird, and it gives you a whole new set of evolutionary components to evolve into if you choose to do so. As you may guess, birds are able to fly, which gives them a pretty nice advantage in terms of combat, but taking a hit will immediately cause them to crash to the ground. You're free to finish the stage either way, and the choice won't affect the game in any meaningful way other than playstyle. This game also introduces a subplot involving some strange crystals that aren't native to the planet, which cause creatures to evolve in mysterious ways if they're consumed. This comes to a head later on. Since Chapter 3 focuses on the age of the dinosaurs, you can expect to end that chapter with a bang. Chapter 4 is easily the most fantastical and surreal, and that's with the consideration that you can find a secret area with spaceships in Chapter 3. This stage begins by judging whether or not you deserve to become a mammal. Mammals have a distinct advantage in this stage because, unlike other animals, they don't slip on the ice as they walk. The game's overworld also begins to resemble our planet as we know it a little more. This stage also has a hidden bird fortress in the sky that you invade. After you defeat the Bird King, it's revealed that the fortress was held afloat by the power of these mysterious What the hell am I playing? This whole subplot is silly. It really throws away what is an otherwise decent premise by overly relying on this alien technology trope, especially with how it comes together for the final boss. The finale of this stage is especially melodramatic and harsh. You solidify your dominance over the planet by murdering a family of Yetis and watching their child cry over their fallen corpses. This wipes out their entire race, and all Gaia has to say is, yeah, it sucks, but be realistic. If you didn't kill them, someone else would have anyway. Good job there, buddy.
Some cold, brutal shit right there.
And that appropriately leads you to the final stage, Early Man. Fitting. As you may have guessed, by this point you can evolve into a human being. Technically speaking, you can evolve into a human being even earlier, but a first-time player may not know how to do it. However, if you're kind to this Stegosaurus hiding in this jungle, he'll let you in on the secret, and he'll tell you the components that you need. From here, it's just a few more stages until you reach the final boss, Bullbox. Bullbox is an insane amoeba who thinks that he has evolved into the evolutionary apex by consuming all of those mysterious crystals that were left lying around. In reality, the fight against him is really different. He'll occasionally swat at you with his extendable arm, and he'll spit out the crystals that swirl around in his body as summons for you to deal with before you can attack him directly. He's a challenging encounter, but once you defeat him, you finally earn the right to enter Eden. Wow. That means that we were Eden all along. Yeah, all part of nature's great plan. Oh, yeah, it's also revealed that those crystals that were left behind on Earth were done so by Martians who disobeyed the Prime Directive and meddled with our evolutionary history. Are you even surprised by this point? So that's E.V.O, Search for Eden. Is it a great game? No, but it's a serviceable one. It's a game with a great idea, but mediocre execution, and honestly, I think that's what salvages it more than anything else. Games that center around evolution, or at least some kind of permanent or semi-permanent body metamorphosis as its main gameplay mechanic, are relatively few and far between, and E.V.O does enough to keep things interesting, at least for a little while. Fortunately for it, it's also a very short game, clocking in at around 6 or 7 hours, depending on how much time you spend grinding and reloading saves. If you can snag a copy for relatively cheap, it's worth playing. Your best bet is probably grabbing one of those moderately priced Chinese reproduction carts on eBay, notwithstanding resorting to the other big E. E.V.O may not be the smash hit that sparked an entire trend of evolutionary-themed RPGs or sparked a long-running franchise, but at least we can all rest assured that any future attempts at tackling this sort of subject material would learn from its mistakes and shortcomings and use those lessons to make a better, more robust game.